Morning. Welcome to Genesis 2025. It's been a bit of a topsy-turvy year, I guess, all things considered. But I thought I'd just take a few minutes at the start of the day just to set some context about Genesis, One Nucleus, what we do for those who are new to us, and then just hand it over to the experts who know what they're talking about, as opposed to me, maybe. So 25 years, this will be the 25th edition of Genesis, which in some ways sounds scary because it means I've been doing it a long time. But it's a quarter of a century of one of the most privileged things we get to do as One Nucleus, and that's to assemble people who go out there and change other people's lives. And that's a real privilege and an honor for us to do, so thank you for engaging with us. You play such a critical role. And there's some new things for this year, so it's been great to have been working with Life Science Nation around RESI, LRIG, SLAS, Life Science Integrates, and having more of a London Bioinnovation Week of things going on. And it's been a real buzz to it already this week, and it'll carry on through the rest of the week, I'm sure, because we have great gatherings quite often around what's happening in finance, but a lot of it can be later stage. We saw a lot of optimism and deal flow headlines, what's going on globally in financing, a lot of excitement. But for us as a community of One Nucleus membership and network, is how do we take from that and say, what's the things day to day that we can harness that excitement and that energy? So just briefly, and I can talk to what we do for hours, actually. I'm quite happy talking about it, but I wouldn't please you. Some of the highlights of what we do. So I think there's two aspects for One Nucleus and our community. It's those practical things that are day-to-day, things like savings on lab supplies, helping people find the right labs and design and fit them out, the regular events we do, and training. And you'll see on the sides there some of the key things coming up this year, really. So we have our awards dinner celebrating the successes that you create. On Helix is our translational research conference in Cambridge in July. BioBeat, I'm delighted, has come under the One Nucleus umbrella. It's been running quite admirably in its own right for over 10 years, but now it's part of the One Nucleus family. That'll be up at Chesterford Research Park in May. You'll see on the website there's a training sat nav to help companies find routes to effective training for their staff. Going for Gold is something new for us. It's where we work one-to-one with companies, looking at some of the data behind the sort of sector and their targets through PitchBook and Biodecades and these things we subscribe to, making that available to companies to say, how can we help you target the right investors, the right stage, and the right space for you, irrespective of geography. And then next year we'll be back here for Genesis 2026, and I'd hope to see a lot of you then. But working with companies here and trying to enable them to be and facilitate them being the best versions of themselves, they need to connect to deal flow. Ultimately, they need to do deals, raise money, find customers. And these are some of the groups we work with to help get our members showcase discounts, access, and be present at some major events like the Bio Europe's JPM Week we'll be at in January, particularly at the RESI JPM conference, Bio in June, and a couple of new things. So we're going to pilot a bilateral partnering forum with Flanders. It's going to be hosted by VIB in Ghent in February in immunology and immunotherapy. And then we're, in April, alongside our boot camp, we're looking to work to take out some of our leading academic institutes to Boston the same week, and companies that want to come with them, to have a true investment and partnering forum between those two leading ecosystems. I can stand here and do this bit, but actually obviously there's a team behind all of what we do at One Nucleus. I'm amazed how much they put out on my behalf and support me in doing. And they'll be around the conference today. Do say hi to them. Feel free to ask them anything about One Nucleus, but also feel free to let them know what you'd like from One Nucleus. So we can only respond to what people really need at any point in time. And then just to mention, we've had two new additions to the One Nucleus board through the year, in Melanie Leveridge from AstraZeneca and Hannah Saw from Pharma Enabled Therapeutics. Bringing, again, extending that breadth and depth of knowledge on different aspects of our sector from the coalface. And we're delighted to have them join us, and thanks to our, not just the team, but the board for helping steer us through year after year. And we can't do things like Genesis without the support of sponsors, exhibitors, And of course, you as delegates, none of it would work. So I thank you for your investment in supporting us. And I'm going to hand over to Mike Ward just now, who will set us up with a winners and losers. And when we got to the 25th edition of Genesis, I thought hard about, has anybody been at all 25? I narrowed it down to 2 people. I'm one, and I think Mike is the other. So without more from me, I'm going to welcome Mike Ward to the stage.
Yeah, I've been here a long time. And in fact, the reason why I'm doing this is I think in the first edition, the keynote speaker at about 8 o'clock in the morning had called off, and Tony said to me, Mike, you don't have to have a presentation that you could put, you could maybe do. And I said, well, what's the topic? And he sort of told me the topic, and I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it as long as you tell everybody that I've only had 20 minutes to prepare for this. It was Brian Richards. So Brian Richards was the guy who was meant to do the thing. Then in the second year, the keynote was meant to be done by Sir Chris Evans. And I know what Chris is like, so I thought, there's a good chance that he's not going to turn up either. So I actually, in good Blue Peter fashion, I actually prepared something earlier, just in case. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. And then on the third edition, Tony wasn't the CEO at that time, it was Harriet Fear. And Harriet sort of said, who are you going to get to do the keynote? And Tony said, he said, I'm going to get Mike to do it. Now, Harriet is very, very straight-laced and was a bit scared of this floppy-haired character. And she said, are you sure, Tony? And Tony basically said to me, he says, well, he's done it for the last 2 years. And he said, I just don't think it's fair that I actually just, ask him straight on rather than him having to sort of jump in. But I don't think I helped Harriet's blood pressure when the first winners and losers, I introduced what I called the BS index. But actually BS stood for Bruce Springsteen, biotech being born in America, born in the USA, or, for example, Britney Spears, talented but crazy. Bart Simpson, young upstarts, etc., etc. So it was all around the sort of BS thing. But we've been doing this for a number of years. So this year, I've decided to go for a horsey theme. And you'll see at the end, that there for the younger people in the audience is a famous TV star called Mr. Ed. He was a talking horse. So that's why he's there. Now I'm going to try and see if I can work out how this works. Oh, brilliant. Okay. So the idea of a piñata, I actually sort of stole this from Jeremy Levin at the recent Bio-Europe meeting. He was talking about how the industry felt like a piñata because it was basically it was under unprecedented attack from multiple directions at the same time. It's things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was supposed to be a sort of a temporary policy, but clearly has evolved into something as a permanent revenue squeeze on large pharma, and in fact just the eve of Thanksgiving, they put out the latest edition, which is the great thing of putting out bad news just at a holiday when nobody is necessarily noticing, and we're seeing price pressures on the industry. Then you've got the tariffs, and I've been a journalist for a long time, and at the moment, everything's really, really interesting because everything is changing all the time. And I put these slides together at the weekend, and lo and behold, 2 days later, there are already changes to what's gone on around, for example, the tariffs. When I wake up and find out that the US and the UK have actually done a deal around tariffs, obviously it means that we're going to get more expensive drugs. We're also seeing the changes, at the FDA. Commissioner Macquarie is taking a different approach to approval standards, and that uncertainty is clearly, sort of rippling through the entire industry. Pharmacy benefit managers, they're under political pressure also. There's big calls for them to reform, as they've been weaponizing their formularies, and that's having a big impact. Then we've got the Biosecure Act. Now that is forcing the pharma industry to sort of reconsider their supply chain relationships and manufacturing partnerships with China, and I'll show later on that might not be the best thing to necessarily do. And then, of course, we've got the blockbuster drugs. And interestingly, a lot of them, which I'll show later, are under pressure from expiries. So when we sort of look at this, and we also sort of see an industry where we are seeing layoffs, sort of 20,000 plus positions have been cut during the year. And the capital markets are still, relatively sceptical about, what's going on. There's clearly a challenging backdrop for the industry. So I sort of chose the sort of buckaroo, as sort of the buckaroo moment, as the industry sort of facing a kind of perfect storm. What's actually happening is just it's getting multiple threats. There are sort of multiple demands being put on it, and eventually it's all going to kick off. The IRS expansion, that is now, as I say, is a fixture. We're going to see most favoured nations pricing that's going to tie US pricing with lower European and other benchmarks. And for blockbuster drugs, that's clearly going to involve big revenue haircuts. The EU new pharma legislation, a wholesale rethinking of how Europe regulates drug approvals and pricing. And compared with the sort of the Biotech Act 2, essentially, which could be sort of positive for biotech, they're sort of saying, look, we're going to accelerate approvals in Europe, but we're going to maintain tighter price controls. Then we've got China's volume-based pricing system, which basically is squeezing prices for international players while protecting the homegrown Chinese innovators, which again is a sort of a shrewd move on the part of sort of the Chinese. Japan, they're still obviously doing their price revision cycles, so the industry's in trouble. Brazil, it's one of the big emerging markets. It has also been particularly aggressive and unpredictable in its drug pricing reforms. So, we can sort of see that there are a bunch of changes. We've got the UK clinical trials regulation reforms. Now, that could create a more nimble environment, but also the issue is it's going to create regulatory fragmentation. And regulatory fragmentation is a sort of big challenge. We're going to see that with AI, and we're going to see that with pharmacovigilance. The FDA and the EU are developing fundamentally different regulatory approaches to these areas. So, 2026 is going to be a sort of a challenging year. Now, we can debate policy all day, but in fact, ultimately, policy is made by people. So let's talk about some of the individuals. Donald Trump, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. This isn't being recorded, is it? I don't want a $5,000 or $5 billion lawsuit. Basically, the drug pricing clearly hawkish. We've got the sort of the threats of tariffs. They're in, they're out, wherever they're going. People haven't got a clue of what's necessarily going. But clearly, there's an issue. Then we've got Robert F.K. Jr., sort of anti-vaxxer in chief. He's obviously head of health policy. And, him being there represents a genuine ideological shift. He's skeptical towards big pharma, and he's, got an interest in alternative approaches, and it it suggests that we are not going to see industry-friendly FDA policies coming forward. And that is going to be a potential issue. Vinny Prasad, an interesting character, been an outspoken critic of pharmaceutical pricing and also skeptical of the pharmaceutical business models. His appointment, however, does sort of represent a commitment to the rare disease pathways and more flexible approval mechanisms. But there's still, there's still some, scrutiny going to be on the pharma industry. Mark Makary, FDA commissioner, he's focused on patient-centric regulation and innovation. The sort of the introduction of plausible mechanism pathway, however, again, is positive, potentially positive for biotech, but it means, again, less deference to big pharma. Now, I put Wes Streeting up there, but actually I could have chosen any health secretary from the last 25 years, because clearly the UK, although we sort of, tomorrow, Steve Bates, UK biotech cheerleader in chief, will be talking about how the UK is a sort of a great place. But what we're actually sort of seeing is that there, again, is a sort of a focus on pricing, and we've seen, so ironically, some of your big sponsors, Tony, have decided that they're not necessarily going to invest that much in the UK anymore, and that is a sort of a potential, because it's going to disrupt the ecosystem. So so Wes is up there, and I also put up Xi Jinping. So he's he's big boss guy in China, and he has basically been very instrumental in the sort of the revolutionary changes that have taken place in sort of the in China, as China has emerged as an innovative superpower, and therefore what he's actually been doing is creating a sort of strategic innovation ecosystem that actually is positioning Chinese biotechs as serious competitors for global capital and partnerships. So again, this is important. But when you then sort of look at the sort of the Biosecure Act, and you sort of think, right, okay, don't you want to actually be associated with what is potentially going to be the biggest show in town? Interesting. So here's, I sort of looked at the Q4 2024. So this is the last 12 months, or the last 4 quarters. And you can sort of see that the sort of the pharmaceutical industry is generating some big blockbusters. In fact, these account for a huge chunk of the sort of the total pharma take. So there's about $175 billion that's up there. Keytruda, top of the list. So MSD, well done. However, in 2028, the US patents go, and that's clearly going to be a problem once they've got that expiry. Clearly MSD has got to do something to replace $30 billion worth of revenue per year. And if you sort of think that the 10th blockbuster drug is $11 billion, that's essentially they've got to find 3 blockbusters a year to make up for sort of the loss of Keytruda. And if you think I'm being a bit over dramatic, 4 years ago Humira was worth $21 billion. This year it's worth 4. So you can sort of see how much of a drop-off it's going to be. Ozempic and Wegovy, so they're sort of the GLP-1 agonists from Novo Nordisk, combined actually beat Keytruda. So that's more than $31 billion. These drugs have basically transformed obesity in the diabetes landscape, but here's the problem. Firstly, back in 2019, Novo Nordisk either didn't or forgot to pay a 450 Canadian dollar fee to maintain a patent. So, essentially, the patent goes off in Canada in 2026, and already Sandoz is lining up to file for a generic approval. So you can sort of see that this is sort of a potential challenge. Mounjaro from Lilly, though, is the big story. Tirzepatide, right? Whether it's Mounjaro or it's Zepbound, these are clinically superior to the semaglutides of Ozempic and Wegovy, and that has had a sort of a big impact. So although in that 12 months they are behind, if you actually look at the growth trajectory, Mounjaro and Zepbound are definitely outperforming. So that they're growing at 46% as opposed to Ozempic and Wegovy at just 15%. So you can sort of see that Novo Nordisk is clearly going to overtake. Now, the other thing about this list is, of this 10, by 2032, 2033, 8 of those are going off patent. So I mentioned it's $175 billion. That's potentially at risk over the next 6 or 7 years. Then what we have is the only two that are not are the Lilly drugs, Mounjaro and Zepbound. They don't go off patent until sort of 2036 and beyond. So with that, you can sort of see why it's important that the big pharma needs to do deals with biotechs, either through sort of licensing or through acquisitions. So let's talk about the big winner. So the big winner clearly is Eli Lilly. So I was pleased to sort of notice that that's one of your sponsors, Tony. So clearly got winners backing winners. So that's good. So this is Eli Lilly. Just a few weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, became the first $1 trillion pharma company. So it's basically joined the likes of the sort of the big tech guys. So Meta, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Nvidia. They're all the sort of big guys. So in fact, there are 9. I can't remember who the others are, but those ones I do know because they're the ones I've got in my own portfolio. So I'll be able to retire nicely. Anyway, so if we sort of look that from, say, for example, over the past few years, from, say, 2022, we've seen value creation of $700 billion. And why? Well, so clinical superiority. My God, you're kidding me. I'm only on slide 6. So anyway, so what we can sort of see, it's essentially things like sort of the clinical superiority, the sort of the fact the revenue group is actually exceeding expectations, and the market opportunity, right, is absolutely huge, and clearly Lilly is seen to be the one that is the winner. So obviously this is here's the loser. So poor old Novo Nordisk has really hit the sort of the buffers. It's lost $400 billion in the last 2 years in value. I mean, it's still $200 billion plus, so it's still sort of, a big pharma company. But you can sort of see that that's an issue. Why? Well, it's had clinical disappointments. It hasn't actually, it overpromised on what actually, semaglutide, et cetera, and CagriSema was going to achieve. It said it was going to get 25% weight loss when it only achieved 21%, 22%. So not bad, but unfortunately, they got punished hugely for that. They also lost their CEO, partly because of course, the sort of the value destruction that was going on. But when a CEO of a $200 billion plus company gets removed mid-year, that really gets the alarm bells sounding. And then, because of all this, they've also then had to, keep going out, sort of saying, right, we have to go to cut our guidance. And of course, there's also, as I mentioned, the sort of the patent loss. That again doesn't really sort of help. So, there they are, the guys who basically created the GLP-1 space, and up until recently was still sort of leading that race. Have definitely hit the hurdle. And of course, to make matters worse, they actually attempted to do something about this, and attempted to acquire Metsera, but they were picked at the post by Pfizer, and so again, it's not been a good year for Novo Nordisk, which is why they're a loser. One of the things I'd like to point out, and again, when we sort of talk about the UK, etc., a classic example of UK science. The UK biotech Zip was acquired by Metsera in 2023 for about $100 million. Okay, so the exact figures aren't there, but if you kind of look at the SEC filing, you can sort of add it up. What Metsera acquired is essentially a lot of what has actually driven the sort of the value creation at Metsera, and that value creation actually went up about $5 billion in 1 week when the bidding war, the auction sort of, the bidding war sort of took off. But what we've got here is we've got an example of an Imperial College spin-out being flogged off for about $100 million, and then a couple of years later, it's been sort of valued at billions. And later on we've got a panel, and I will sort of highlight that this is unfortunately not an isolated case. So the disease landscape. Essentially, what we're sort of seeing is that now, interestingly, there was an expectation we're going to see a lot of pharma M&A, but we're not actually seeing that. What we've actually sort of seen is not only a sort of a drop-off, but actually in terms of the sort of the valuations. Now, what we haven't seen is some of the big mega deals, and essentially it's sort of shifting to those sort of mid-range transactions as the sort of the pharma guys are looking to do pipeline filling. Now, interestingly, so obviously M&A is what everybody likes to do. When you consider there aren't that many people who are actually going to be able to acquire, and you can sort of see the number of actually deals that are done, and you sort of think about all the number of biotechs, M&A is kind of like a pipe dream. I think you're lucky if you actually get acquired. If you look at sort of on the other hand, the sort of the actual biopharma deals, the valuations of those, these are sort of the licensing deals, is actually going up. So that actually is a positive note. And even more so is what's interesting is that the value of those deals is also going up, because you can sort of see that actually the number of deals has gone down in recent years, but the valuations are going up. So, in many respects, that's interesting. Here are some of the sort of the leading deals. One of the things I like to point out here is, I'm sorry about this, Tony. 5 minutes, yeah. 2 minutes, right? Okay. So if you look at that list, 4 out of the 10 actually were for Chinese assets, right? For definite Chinese assets, and BioNTech, actually that was a Chinese asset because BioNTech bought a Chinese company called Biotheus, and that's what that deal's about. So, the Chinese assets, Chinese innovation, accounted for 50% of the top 10 leading biopharma deals. And then here we can look at sort of like, sort of M&A. Again, you can sort of see that it's, again, a whole bunch of, sort of the companies, looking to sort of acquire, oncology is in the sort of, is still sort of, the biggest show in town. But, the anticipated M&A, it hasn't really happened. What we are seeing, though, is that when it comes to sort of the partnering, the pharma, the licensing or whatever, it's to acquire these new modalities. Antibody-drug conjugates, RNA technologies, the bispecific antibodies, radioligand therapies, etc. So you can sort of see that the companies are swallowing these up as they look to sort of create next generation molecules. Interestingly, rare diseases, again, going from nowhere, like 25 years ago, it's now, this year, there have been 39 approvals, 69% of them, okay, are in the rare disease space. They actually accounted for more than 50% in 2020. But you can sort of see rare diseases is actually a sort of a big space. And again, it's very, very useful for biotechs because it's an area where biotechs can actually play and actually have a sort of a business model. And of course, a lot of the deals that we're seeing, right, so the licensing deals around artificial intelligence. And the question is, is it actually going to make a difference or not? But you can sort of see, you've got people like AZ has been really sort of digging deep on the AI space. Next year we're going to see some probably some interesting readouts to sort of see how useful is AI actually going to be in drug discovery. Notable unicorns. So, these are, private companies that are worth $1 billion. Again, you sort of see that in most cases, it's around AI. So, that's, is there a bubble there or not? But we've got GLP-1s, and we've also got cell therapies. So, but I just thought I'd put that up. And also, I thought it was a cute pic. Now, what we have seen is that and we'll probably hear it in the next panel, the market now looks to be on and up since the, sort of like the mid-year. But in fact, it just keeps going up and down, up and down. At the moment, biotech is actually outpacing some of the other some of the indices. Last year, it was the complete reverse. But when it sort of comes to sort of global financing, it's there or thereabouts. But the IPO market really isn't there, and there will be talk about it could come back, but we're not really seeing very much of it. What we are seeing though is we're seeing a concentration of the funds going into fewer companies. So 8% of all transactions accounted for half the funds. Next year's Chinese Year of the Horse, and these are the reasons why China needs to be taken very, very seriously. We're also producing a report today, which you can download from the Clarivate site for free. So that'd be worth doing. And then, so here are the the main conclusions. It's 2026 is going to be a fairly tough year. People are definitely going to have to sort of identify the next generation assets, but execute that clinically. Don't do a Novo Nordisk. But also what we're hearing from sort of the investors is they've got to manage their capital in a disciplined way. I'm sorry for taking a little bit more time than expected. Not expected, expected. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I think 25 years probably qualifies you for a little bit of flexibility, I think. And it's always really insightful data to set the tone for the day, really. So I think we can forgive that a little bit, I think, Mike, and it'll drop off our caffeine intake a little bit. We move on to the next panel, 'cause I think, again, it's great seeing all that happen. We saw 2 or 3 weeks ago through Jeffrey's week just how much excitement of an upturn we are in financing, because fundamentally someone has to pay. And so the next panel, I'm delighted, is going to look just at that. What's happening in the money? Where is it flowing? To whom? Why? What can we expect? And I'm delighted to welcome Eva Haas from Optimum and the panel to the stage, if they would. Wasn't ready to appear.
I don't have a mic anywhere else, so. Okay, welcome everyone. As you can see, we have an illustrious panel, so I'll just ask every individual to briefly introduce themselves, what they do, what their experience is, what they're interested in, and then we'll take it from there after that. So perhaps starting at the far end.
Well, morning everyone. I'm Frank Crawford. I rejoice under being a serial entrepreneur. The most recent company that I founded was a UCL spin-out via Nautis. I founded it and I led it for 7 years. It's a genetic nanomedicines company. Now I am building a portfolio of chairs, NED positions. And what I really want to do is contribute, give back experience to our great life science sector.
Hi, I'm Kate Rowley, so I'm the CEO of Verso Biosense. We are an intrauterine monitoring company, and the first one in the world to do this. I'm also a consultant that works in early stage startups and growth companies. I'm exec chair of a company that's spinning out from Leeds called AccentBio that works on CNS drug discovery. And I'm also an investor in women-led businesses and biosciences. So very interested in the area and making sure that we have that diversity within the area.
Hi everybody, great to meet you and thank you for having me here. My name is Soyoung Park. I'm general partner of 1004 Venture Partners located in San Francisco Bay Area. My thesis is healthy aging, so I'm actually looking for transformative technologies to support healthy aging. I'm looking forward to this discussion today. I love to talk with you if your thesis fits with your technology. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Janette Thomas, and until recently I was CEO of AccentBio. We were in healthy aging, we had a new target and new drugs, and I can tell you some of my experience about fundraising early stage companies. In general, my passion is about getting new technologies and innovations through to becoming a viable company and developed to get to market. So I like working with early stage companies and founding scientists and doing whatever's needed in order to get that technology through. So thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm Jenny Laird. I work for Eli Lilly. I'm Vice President looking after business development, search and evaluation. And despite everything you heard earlier on about obesity, Eli Lilly also does neuroscience, and that's my area. So I lead a global team, and our objective is finding new, exciting opportunities to fill the Lilly portfolio in the neuroscience area. We cover everything from really early stage, academic spin-outs or even collaborations with academic institutions, all the way out to large M&As and partnering even with Pierre Pharma. So I'm here, of course, to find out more about what's going on in the ecosystem and make new contacts and find new exciting things for the neuroscience space.
Tim Davis from the primary markets team at the London Stock Exchange. That's the part that runs the main market on behalf of the Financial Conduct Authority. We own, operate and regulate the AIM market, and more recently we've launched private securities market, which is a secondaries market for, in this scenario, UK private companies and investors on the other side.
Okay, thanks everyone. So our first sort of question is going to be around the fact that everyone's investing later stage, and there are larger deal sizes going on the venture side, and to some extent on the public market side. So with larger deal sizes, you know, there does appear to be a gap between well-funded and less well-funded smaller life science companies evolving. Is it going to widen further? What will the next few years look like? Will anything change? And then some of you can talk about, perhaps about your experience with those early stage life science companies, especially seed funding, where the biggest gap seems to be, and practical advice. So perhaps if we can go along the row again, if you're all right with that, or if anyone wants to chime in.
Yeah, well, I don't think that it's breaking news that it has been a funding desert for quite a long period. And looking at the numbers, 2021, curiously being the lockdown year, was actually quite a high level of investment, and I'm talking about equity investment in the main. But then when we get into 2022 and 23, we're seeing a substantial a falling back of the amount of investment that there is in companies. We're seeing a revival in 24, and then this year is also is looking like we're seeing a few green shoots. But of course, equity investment is not the only area there that attracts finance. We've got other areas such as government and grant funding, and also the public markets. We all know also that the public markets are closed, have been closed for quite some time. So that is not for IPOs anyway, so that is not a particularly useful immediate route of raising money. There are some follow-ons. So I think there are some green shoots, but it is very, very tough on the ground getting investment, and I think you have to be clever in the way you build syndicates, think about alternative participants, so a mixed bag, not just corporate ventures, but also VCs, but I also brought a charity in, for example, into funding a company that I funded, Via Nortis. So that is a sort of a kick-off, if you would like, of how I see this landscape. And I think there is a widening, as Eva has said, because also some of the seed rounds have become much larger, what you might more previously have described as an A round, and that probably means that you've got other companies that aren't getting anything. So if somebody's getting 30 million in a seed round, there are probably 4 or 5 other companies that aren't getting anything. So I don't know, does somebody else want to come?
Sorry, I just got a weird look from Jenny when I said everyone's investing later stage. Sorry, I was talking with a sort of more biotech mindset in terms of sort of at the level of, you know, proof of concept data phase 2, just to clarify that. Sorry, carry on.
So I think what I've seen is that people are definitely doing kind of bigger deals, which means there's kind of a lot less left for those companies that are sort of in this middle, where they've started, they've got some funding, they might have even had a kind of seed finance at a modest level, but they're finding that they can't actually progress. We thankfully have seen the government step in with Innovate UK Biomedical Catalyst now, albeit that the round opened really late and the deadline for submissions is the 10th of December. And prior to that, I was quite concerned that their funding mechanisms seemed to go down accelerator routes. There seems to be, personally, a proliferation of accelerators. It's a place where you might be able to get money, but you might get 200k, of which 100k or 60k is designated for the accelerator. Now, if you are a company or a seasoned individual that has been around the block and done lots of different ventures, you don't really want to go an accelerator, but if that's the only way you're going to get financing to start something and get it off the ground, you're probably going to go to it. But of that, then you only might have 10 companies going forward for a pot of money that has been shoehorned and kind of closed by Innovate UK. So if that was the only route, it means that lots of money has been spent on accelerators to get lots of companies started off the ground into markets where nobody's funding it at a later stage. So certainly compared to a few years ago, I think we're seeing lots and lots and lots of companies starting, but nobody going anywhere who's at that kind of like mid-tier level, because no one's willing to finance anything and nobody wants to do that level of investment.
I don't know what can I add on all of this, but I just kind of want to give you a little bit different perspectives because I came from the United States. So, as you know, I never really said this is the winter in the biotech, but now I actually say that it's a literally nuclear winter. Unfortunately, we didn't have seen a lot of IPOs the last 2 years. And we also need to deal with our new administration's policy changes. And we still feel like we are very uncertain about what we are going. We all know our new administration is very into the longevity type of technology, but it's not going to go to health system right away. It takes a long time if they really can make it, but still not sure if they can actually make any changes. So I actually see some possibilities and potential for non-US companies, because now the one thing we are very elaborated is Crawford administration accepts the RNA data from outside the United States. It wasn't like that, but now you have better chance. You have using your abundant and very rich R&D talents and resources in your region, and then bring to the bigger market in the future. That's all now acceptable. So that's how we can actually see you can reduce your, maintain your capital efficiency. So there's there's a lot of needs, but there's two big items. You need to make a fast development of your technology based on your long-term science, and then execute it in a very, very low cost effectively. So those kind of how we can achieve that. As mentioned, there's a lot of grants out there. Unfortunately, in the United States, almost half of our non-dilutive grants are canceled. So that's another reason you see a lot of projects actually canceled. I'm very afraid our scientists in the United States actually exodus for the US, and they go to Singapore, and then they go to Dubai. Those kind of areas attracts a lot of talents. So we definitely see a lot of paradigm changes in the investment as well. So as the previous session, we talk about a lot of assets is acquired by China, and what does it mean? China's famous of making all the study very fast. They can do 1,000 subjects in 3 months. Can you achieve that level of speed? And then also very cost effective. We want to see this kind of technology doesn't also be kind of offshore, that our scientists, we actually cultivated for 10 to 20 years, benefited. But still, as you see, our competition is going to way, way beyond our expectation. So at that time, I think I always feel very bad to ask you to pivot in the life science, but unfortunately, I think this is time I need to ask. You always need to think about what is the market needs, which means the big pharma companies, like in this kind of difficult time, Eli Lilly become a first $1 trillion company, and we actually aligned with what a future liquidity event can happen. So, as a VC, we are not just seeing your science and technology. We actually see how this technology can go to the real market and then can be executed with a big pharma. So basically, how can you make money, and how can you can sell your company to the market, or either public market or private market? I'll stop there.
Oh, actually, a lot of these themes, I can talk about how we put it in practice. So when I started working with 5-alarm-bio, we raised our early pre-seed round based on some early science, and that was great. We had to get to achieve certain milestones. We achieved those and exceeded the milestones that were expected. But we came across now, trying to raise our seed round, an inability to raise money now. So what we did over the past 3 years, we managed to have some great relationships with Eli Lilly and get feedback on what we needed to do in order to get this next round. But the goalposts changed from when we first raised money. So we didn't have enough to get us far enough to actually get investment. We, with the help of Babraham Campus, managed to get various little grants. It all helps you manage your cash flow. And I'd say any small companies, like, look at your cash flow and look at your long-term cash flow, because the company now, it hasn't gone into liquidation. We've managed to keep it going. The IP is safe, and we've got every opportunity of raising money for some really fantastic technology as soon as things change. But I agree with what you were saying. Be creative in terms of how you're going to develop that company, your strategy, mergers perhaps, grant funding, working with other companies. So I just think the creativity's got to be there, but also creativity and massive networking. Just talk to investors and work out who your potential investors are going to be. Know if the milestones and requirements are changing, and then get them to really know and learn and understand your business, that you are ready with the right package when you need to raise money next time. The VC world is quite tricky. They always say, oh, you've got to build relationships. But you can't possibly build a relationship with every VC. But you can work out what VC might be most interested in your company and build a relationship with a few of them so that you're developing the right package for investment and the right market opportunity for the long term.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've talked about sort of equity and venture. So maybe one of the other components, which was mentioned in our keynote at the beginning, is the licensing. So that is also a source of investment, so collaborations essentially with other biotechs, potentially larger biotechs, but also large pharma. And I mean, we also, Lilly collaborated with Fran, I know, we signed a partnership. So those things do, I mean, I don't know how it feels from the other side of the table, but from our side, of course, this is a really, sometimes we end up doing more than one licensing or collaboration deal with the same company. You start on something small and then, you help, obviously for them, that provides, I guess, finance and things to do, not necessarily all focused on the specific project, but some opportunities to do other things with that money. And then we came back and did a larger partnership for one of their late-stage assets. That happens quite often. So that is another opportunity. And you see this, I mean, again, all these horse pictures. There was one of a merry-go-round, and that is true. Things go up and down, right? And so the M&A market for us looking at licensing to a certain extent, but certainly M&A, the kind of quality or what we're looking for doesn't really change over time. We're very driven by the science. I mean, what we're looking for in terms of quality. We are out there looking for something that fits strategically with our portfolio, so that, fits with the skills that Lilly has in a particular space, and where we can see the unmet need and we see the quality, the technical merit of the asset and all of the things that have been done in the program. But what changes with this up and down and round of the roundabout is as other factors, the global markets and so on, the valuations, especially of public companies, go up and down. And some of the time, they are valued so high that we can't, as we say, get to value. In other words, there's no space for us to actually add value and make money in the overall equation, while the shareholders still get the kind of premium that they expect. So the roundabout will continue round, won't it? We're doing there's an uptick in M&As, especially smaller ones. They don't come up in the top 10, but you can see the sort of the 1 billion and below are actually going up quite a lot now, partly because of this it's easier now to achieve a valuation that makes sense for a pharma company. So, I mean, I guess I would say there are plenty of ways. And my other point, I think, when you sit in the UK, of course, you are obviously, very understandably, very focused on non-dilutive capital from the UK. But again, going around the world and globally, there are some jurisdictions which seem to have much easier access. I mean, certainly, I rarely meet a French biotech that dies because of lack of money. They will die because, you know, the idea didn't work out, or the hypothesis, or other factors, but not. It's quite rare that, you know, they kind of, if they're tenacious, they keep going, and somehow they get money from somewhere. So, I guess there may be lessons for, you know, policymakers in the UK, but also for us, those people looking for money and seeking to support biotechs, which is another of the aspects that certainly we Lilly do, is it's not just about BD and licensing and M&A. We also have a whole suite of activities designed specifically to collaborate with early stage biotechs and entrepreneurs. So we have Lilly Gateway Labs. We have in the audience Verena, who can tell you more about Lilly Gateway Labs, which offers kind of space and support and mentorship to companies. We have Lilly Ventures, sort of classic, and then also Explore R&D, a kind of suite of ways to work with biotech. It's not a CRO, but kind of offering skills from inside Lilly in a very cost-effective way for small biotech. So there's lots of other things that you can look at. Easy to say, I know from my position, but don't just stick to the UK, I guess I would say.
Okay, so just changing gear slightly and going back to the original question about, let's call it capital supply in the UK. Putting the public markets to one side, because I think we all acknowledge it's been a very difficult 5 years for fairly obvious reasons, including in the UK, one or two self-inflicted wounds as well, which have complicated things. And I think you also have to be realistic in whichever way you read the budget, and not to politicise it, last week's budget, is that the UK is looking frighteningly like it's going to be flatlining for the next few years. And also a lot of the pain that was dished out in the budget isn't actually going to kick in for 2 or 3 years. So the outlook is still, I would argue, a little uncertain. All of that said and done, come back to reality, which is that I spend a lot of my time talking to, finding, engaging with currently private companies across all sectors, but I happen to do a lot of what we call healthcare, which is the full gamut of biotech, medtech, devices, platform businesses, and so on. And there's a couple of observations on that, which is that it strikes me that we've got, over the last few years, for probably obvious reasons, we've got many, many, many more startups than ever before in this country across the piece, all chasing the same money. The second thing is that I would argue with some conviction that the UK remains an extraordinarily supportive and benevolent place for startups and early stage companies. You've had the extension of SEIS, EIS and VCT. We've talked about non-dilutive grants. You have got a lot of often hidden pockets of capital as well. So the family offices, the high net worths, the angel groups. You've got the regional, or companies that manage regional funds. So think Mercia, Foresight, and so on and so forth. And one of the common discussion points with founders, let's say, is you explain your business to me, as I come from a corporate advisory background. I can understand enough about science to know whether it feels right or not, and also how they're presenting it. But it presupposes also that the proposition in question is bankable and is actually an investable business as well. So that's another thought for any founders in the room. But the other thing about the UK is we are incredibly good at creating science and technology. We are even better at giving it away, typically to overseas buyers. And we have spent, you think stock exchanges, they run markets, it's all about, you know, value and companies and so on. Actually, we spend as much of our time deeply involved in what we call advocacy. Some of the tabloids would think the London Stock Exchange is part of the British government. It's not. You know, we are an ecosystem player. We work very closely with the government in the guise of the Treasury, work very closely with regulators across the piece and so on. We have been very, very involved over the last 3 to 4 years in the two parallel areas of regulatory, and I'm talking regulatory in terms of the public markets, not science regulatory, in terms of righting what had gone awry there, but also in terms of the pension fund reform, where, again, not many people know this, but we've got one of probably the second or third largest captive pension fund globally, but we don't invest it in ourselves. There is a shocking statistic, which my toes curl every time I say it, but here goes. 20 years ago, UK pension funds had a 53% allocation to the UK. That is now 4% and shrinking. So we're not investing in ourselves. So fast forward to the pension fund reform, which is a very, very, very big piece of work. And I have to give both the government and the likes of the FCA credit for all the heavy lifting they've been doing. You're probably thinking, yeah, we heard about Mansion House Compact, then Mansion House Accord, and now the Sterling 20, and it all sounds great, but where's the money? And the reality is this, that the money is actually starting to flow, and some. So, give you a couple of examples. You need to keep a close eye on what the British Business Bank is saying. So, for example, week before last, they put out an announcement which was around, I always get this wrong, but it's British Growth Partnership Fund 1, which is an initial, I stress initial, 200 million of pension fund money going into a new fund which is for investing in high-growth British companies. That money is coming from Aon UK, M&G, and a third one who momentarily escapes me, but they're all Mansion House players. That same announcement alludes to work being done on another new fund, which is going to be, if you like, a vessel for money which is coming as a result of a parallel project which is kicked off, which is the rationalisation of the local government pension funds in the UK, of which we've got 82 or 83, valued somewhere between 800 and 1 trillion. And again, the plan you probably read is to create a number of teacher-style super funds, if you like, to invest at scale. And then one final example is that our occupational scheme at the Exchange, and there's about 22,000 of us globally, we all had a letter about 6 months ago saying you can opt out, but if we don't hear from you, we're putting 12% of your funds in your individual pension pots into a new fund which is being invested in high-growth companies and other things. So, again, you could be forgiven for thinking there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of talk on the part of the government and others, but I can assure you it's very real. It has been frustrating in terms of the rate of flow and application, but it is now starting good and proper. And finally, on the budget, a couple of wins for us, which we have been, I love using the term lobbying, which is a slightly grubby word in this day and age, but we do lobby and hard. Two things in the budget for us, two wins. One was the rethink of cash ISAs, with a portion going into UK listeds. And the second was the stamp duty holiday on IPOs for 3 years. And that's a really important thing, because that then opens the door to the bigger conversation, which is stamp duty on shares on the public market, which is levied, which makes us, again, manifestly uncompetitive against other markets. So be patient, be encouraged, it really is starting to change.
Okay, if we can perhaps talk about sources of capital and whether they're changing from the point of view of geography, charities, new sources, what sort of problems can this cause? Is founder diversity changing investor mix? And how, if there are problems in your experience, could we perhaps solve them? Or perhaps it's, one of those things that's difficult to answer. If you don't mind, again, unless somebody wants to chime in and get their words in right now, if we start at the far end and move across, just so that everyone gets a word in, or if if you're desperate to say something.
Mix it up a bit, but anyway. Yeah. There's a lot in there, Eva, that you have that you have said, and as I alluded to when I was in the first comments that I made, I think that it is important to really consider a wide diversity of investment types and bringing that together as a syndicate. I think just sort of taking a slight sidetrack here, we ought to be thinking, and also Mike said it in his presentation, about the influence of China. There is, and the Asia region as a whole, but particularly China. China did 1/3 of all clinical trials globally last year. That is up from 5% in 10 years ago. I looked up these facts and figures, so I know they're right. And that then gives them an intro into the way they want to fund things. They're pulling talent back into China to fund new startups, and then those are coming back out and into the pharma ecosystem. So we need to sort of think about how that plays in. And there are also Chinese investment funds here in the UK, such like Trustpark and others, that are investing in British companies. It's about getting, I suppose, braver in some ways about interacting and investigating it, which I think is important. The mix, I think, is important. I mean, I sort of skipped over the corporate, but corporate investors, corporate ventures, so that's the big pharma companies, have separate arms which also invest into your companies. So as Jenny was saying, make those relationships, and Janette also said it, make those relationships and make them early, because then you can attract not only an R&D deal or a collaboration, but there could also be investment, equity investment that comes alongside that. Probably important to think about having 2 corporate ventures in your syndicate, just for balance. Then you can bring in the VCs, but as I also said, I did bring in a charity, which was a major US charity in cystic fibrosis, a foundation, very rich charity. They're completely set up for investing. They've invested in 70 different biotech companies around the world. It did mean that we needed to undertake a project in cystic fibrosis, but they are very, very good investors, very supportive. They don't take your IP, and you can move along with those projects. So that's a little bit about the mix that you can bring together.
Sorry, I've just been given the sort of 5-minute warning, pretty much. So if everyone can kind of keep it to one major point that they want to talk about, just so that we get everyone done and everyone can have a say. Thanks.
So very quickly in terms of founder diversity, so having spent a number of years in particularly focused on women-led ventures in biosciences, I'm not sure that the next few years are really going to be any different than they are now, which is still a dominance of men leading even women-led, women-focused femtech businesses. We did see at the time when we were raising a fund in this area, much more appetite in the US around women-specific investment funds. That's sort of gone away now because of the change of administration within the US. Always within Europe, it's been much more of a focus on actual environmental, and I don't actually see the landscape changing that much in the next few years. We need to do more. Diversity is a great thing. Having diverse ways of thinking is a way to make a difference, but essentially it comes down to risk for investment, and investment is largely male focused, and you will always bet on the things that look most like you, which is why we're getting fewer women getting funding.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I think Tim already explained a lot of us diverse source of the fund. So those, now I see the companies actually going to multiple direction. Not before they really aligned with a VC, but now CVC is a big player, and of course the licensing. How to actually get the cash flow is the kind of the best way than just get the equity funding, in my opinion. But I always kind of insist. I know you are open to get any sources of the fund and to ensure your cash flow. But I just want to ask you, when you actually select your equity investor, please be very careful not to have too many people in your cap table, I like to ask you to more strategic when you choose your investor. Who will be your partner in the long term? Who will actually bring your more strategic value? Who will actually kind of continuously involved in your journey? I think that's the one thing I really like to ask you to think when you do your fundraising.
I think I can just add on, when you early stage, you're going for angel investors, and you tend to have quite a few people that might put in relatively small amounts of money, but that can be managed. But I think you need to have that conversation up front so that they know they'll have maybe an angel representative and form a consortium later. So you want to make sure your angels are happy with that and that they will comply with that, or maybe put that in your terms and conditions somewhere. So just be careful. It doesn't mean to say you can't have more people. Just make sure that's manageable in the future. And then I had founded a company working in wound care, and we were very interested in going to China because of the manufacturing. We found manufacturers. We were near the clinic, and to do early stage clinical trial, to do the clinical trial to show proof of concept in China for the Chinese market. And I love that. Unfortunately, COVID got in the way, but I really enjoyed that. But I really recommend you have an advisor on China, understand Chinese IP, because you can get different types of intellectual property in China. So just don't think you can form your own relationships. Just make sure you've got to get advice and work with people over the long term.
I think in the interest of time, I will.
One word, Crowdcube. Don't forget the platforms that are out there, which have, again, a lot of very deep-pocketed people. And also, don't forget about venture debt. There are the likes of Citi, HSBC Innovation Bank, and so on, who are incredibly supportive and have some quite clever products.
With that, I believe it's coffee time, so I'd like to thank everyone on the panel very much. It's amazing how time flies and how it's actually quite difficult to get everything in. Thank you.
So, welcome back from the morning coffee break. I hope that you had a good time meeting some of the enhanced profile takers, exhibitors, other people that you haven't seen in a while, or new faces, and reconnecting. So a really important part of the day, as well as the thought leadership that we're sharing in the auditorium. So just a brief word around, there's two streams going on at the moment. So there's a company showcase element that's running in parallel, as you'll probably be aware. So if you are part of that session, you're in the wrong auditorium. So if you're currently part of the SBC company showcase, please can you make your way to the other auditorium? That'd be much appreciated. Thank you. So as we continue to welcome delegates in, it's my job just to welcome up the next panel. So the title of our next panel is How Will Medicines Be Developed and Paid For in 2050? And it's been kindly sponsored by Marks & Clerk. Actually, what ties in really nicely to this is you may have seen out in the main auditorium by the One Nucleus owls, there is a Wishes for Santa box. So part of what we want to do is to kind of harness all of your incredible inspiration, insights and thoughts, and possibly this panel might help with that. So during the lunch break, it would be fantastic if you felt that you could contribute to that. So you just need to go find the owls by the Christmas tree in the main exhibition area. So just to keep us to timing, so the next panel has strictly 40 minutes. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage, so the moderator is Will Arends from Marks & Clerk. So would Will and his panel please join the stage? Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. As you heard, I'm Will Arends. I'm a patent attorney at Marks & Clerk, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel today with our distinguished panel members. Now, as we heard, the subject of the panel today is how will new medicines be developed and paid for in 2050? Now, when Tony first proposed this title to me, I put on my IP hat and thought, I know why he's picked 2050. That's 25 years from now. That's the maximum term of protection you can get for a therapeutic, 20 years of patent term, 5 years of SPC or patent term extension. But as you heard, that's not the case. It's another 25 years of genesis we have in mind. But just putting that aside for 1 second, I think it's a really interesting horizon to be looking at, because it does mean that the drugs that are being developed right now that are maybe having preclinical work done on, patents are about to be filed, those could be the most valuable patents and most valuable drugs in 25 years' time for the innovators. So, as I say, a really relevant horizon to be looking at. So, with that thought in mind, I'll ask our panel to introduce themselves briefly. Time is against us, but Lisa, why don't you start?
Hello, I'm Lisa Urquhart. I'm a journalist. I've been covering the sector for over 20 years. As you can see, there isn't actually a company next to my name, so that means I am free to say pretty much what I feel and want without anybody from corporate coming down on me. So, yeah, that's me.
Hi everyone, Mel Leveridge from AstraZeneca. I'm a vice president within our Discovery Sciences organisation in biopharma R&D, and as you heard in the opening as well, I've also got the privilege of having joined the One Nucleus board this year, so good to be with you all.
Hi everyone, I am the founder and CEO of Mursla Bio. Mursla Bio is a precision medicine diagnostic company, and we are leveraging a new class of liquid biopsy based on organ-specific extra vesicles. Our lead product is a test that received the first FDA breakthrough designation for 5 years, I think, in liver cancer surveillance. And also we just struck a collaboration with the big pharma to develop the first extracellular vesicle-guided precision medicine in fatty liver disease.
Hello everybody, my name is Nara Daubeney. I am the CEO of Phaim Pharma. We do antigenic immunomodulatory therapies, which are first and best-in-class drugs in autoimmune disease. We're going into the clinic with our type 1 diabetes drug in the new year, and we've just been named one of MedCity's life science companies to watch for this year.
Hello everyone, my name is Pervaise Khan. I work with Ernst & Young. I am not an accountant like the majority of Ernst & Young or EY. My background is a mixture of research, then in big pharma, and then into consulting advisory. And I currently run the life sciences practice at Ernst & Young. So that's a mixture of consulting, strategy, deals and transactions, which we're sort of focused a lot on coming up to JP Morgan, and audit and tax, just to give you a kind of flavour of the types of themes I look at.
Okay, thank you very much. So what I'd like to ask, first of all, is if you could each just gaze into a crystal ball and give me your views as to what may be the big new therapies in 25 years' time and what the biggest challenges could be in getting those out to market. Obviously, many possibilities there, but it's just interesting to have your thoughts. So, yeah, why don't we start from this end again, Lisa?
For me, I think the big therapies I'm most interested in are basically, it's neurological. We still haven't quite got a handle on the brain yet. We're still throwing an awful lot of spaghetti at walls, hoping it's going to stick. So for me, I think I'm excited about things that do actually, we're going to get to the point where we get drugs that do cross the blood-brain barrier, and we can actually properly get to the etiology of a lot of the diseases of the brain, which we don't do at the moment. So for me, I think alongside things like obviously Alzheimer's, I'd like to see other things like perhaps also sort of like, neurology diseases linked to immunology, like, Parkinson's, ALS, MS. So for me, those are the big things. But I think the challenge is, as I said, we still don't quite understand the brain. So I think when I think any developments or breakthroughs there, I'm particularly interested in.
I think for me there are a couple of things. I think by 2050 we're going to see a lot more transformative medicines that are curative, so kind of once and done therapies. Obviously we're already starting to see that with many of the cell therapies. challenges, obviously, at the moment for those are a lot around, the patient experience, patient access, and also manufacturing. But as the science is evolving there, we're seeing more around allergenic cell therapies and now also in vivo cell therapies. So actually, editing patient cells inside the patient body, and that's a much nicer patient experience. It's more of an injectable medicine, not so much time in hospital. So I think that's going to become much more of a part of the treatment paradigm. The other thing that I would say is, we've got an aging population. I'm told 60 is the new 40, which I'm sure many of us in the room makes us happy. So we need to think, people will be living for longer. We want people to live for longer and be healthier. But realistically, people will have comorbidities as we have an aging demographic. And so that means that it won't be so much around treating a single disease, but really thinking about combinations of therapies and very individualized combinations of therapies for different patients as well. So these kind of synergistic combinations, I think, will be very important when we look ahead to 2050.
So yeah, when I look at the questions, I was trying to think what if the North Star would be, what would be the highest clinical needs in 25 years, and ultimately we know very well you need some kind of economics behind. So what's going to drive the dollar value of these new medicines? Because otherwise, as you know, there are a lot of unmet clinical need, and they are not, no one is really looking at them because no dollar value can be generated. As Melanie was saying, you can look at the demographics. So there will be. So I think there are two types. You have the one that can have a strong ability to pay, all the Western countries, and Asia actually is changing a lot, and the one that actually don't have so much to pay. So I would differentiate those two. But in the one that have a strong ability to pay, there will be 2 billion people in 25 years that are over 65. 400 million, I look at the numbers, 400 million, that will be over 80. They will be mostly located. And you look at Asia, GDP of Asia now is like 40%. 35%, and the Western world is like 45%, and it's going to change in 25 years. So Asia is going to be 55%. Western world is going to be 30% only, right? So also looking at geography. And then, so I read this book, and you might know this one called Outlive by Peter Attia, but I like his framework. So I think you would have cardiometabolic disease that focus, you would have, cardiovascular disease, metabolic, you would have neurology, and you have oncology. I think that's the 4 chronic liver disease we'll have to deal with that will still generate and drive dollar value. I'm sure we'll talk more, but that's how I've been thinking about it.
It's almost as if this was planned, because I'm going to pull the last 3 together, actually, because it's the real piece around that everyone's talking about is about longevity. So if you sort of look at research would suggest that the maximum a human body can live to, if it could and everything worked, is probably about 150. And it's thought that the thing that finishes your few in the end is your inability to bounce back to the same level as what you were at before you had the last insult, whether it's a broken hip, an MI, an episode of pneumonia, whatever it is. So a lot of the longevity is trying to minimize those risks. So there is a piece around prevention, or the aspects that Pierre has just picked up, which is why GLPs have done so well, because not only it is a weight reduction, but reduces all the other risks that carries, including diabetes, cardiovascular, metabolic, etc. So the bit that I think we will focus on increasingly is all the bit that falls under longevity. How do we keep people well for longer? And that's around an element of risk factor prevention. Obviously, cancer is a piece, but I would be doing a disservice if I didn't say actually some of these chronic diseases, like autoimmunity, which give you a huge disease burden and affects 1 in 10 people across the world, will be the focus, is how do we keep people well for longer with good quality of life.
Yes, by the time you get to the end of the panel, I won't repeat any of those. I think what I'm probably most interested in is a mixture of how do we, it's a bit like our ongoing MOT. So what diagnostics can we have to make sure that we understand actually where our body's at and make those adjustments? So it's a mixture of well-being, but also a mixture of like those precursors and markers to things that can be really detrimental to our health. And we're sort of seeing some of those start to come up now. We have seen post-COVID in terms of those. But actually, are there things that we can have more, actually sensors of things that it's much easier for us? And with the pace of technology change, that's actually going to be quite possible. So I think that's one. And then the second thing, actually, I'm probably most excited about, and I think Pierre touched on it a little bit, is democratization. So how do we just increase access around the world, not to those that have the privilege to be able to pay for it, but actually to really widen the access to keep the planet healthy and well as a whole.
Okay, thank you all very much. And just to pick up on some of those points, Mel, I think it was you that mentioned about once and done therapies and highly synergistic combinations or high personalized synergistic combinations. And I was just wondering if any of you had thoughts on how that will affect sort of business models of how drugs will be developed.
Can I pick that up, actually? Because I think that's a really interesting point. So one of the things that you and all the people who are sort of running biotechs and pitching to investors, et cetera, knows, that's one of the questions, is it a one and done, or how often do I have to give it? So it's really important to look what's out there. So when you're developing a drug, you have to keep the patient in your forefront of your mind as to how this is going to work. A case in point for our area is actually Tzield, which was Prevention Bio that was bought by Sanofi for 2.9 billion, which is a nice payday by anybody's standard of imagination. But one of the issues that they have found is that the uptake is quite low. Why is it low? Other than the fact that it costs 200,000 for a treatment, is because it needs an IV injection under medical supervision over 28 days, and it does carries with it a degree of immunosuppression, as it would because it's an anti-CD3. So what is incredibly promising it delays type 1 diabetes, marvelous. When it becomes it has to be acceptable to the patient who'd be willing to put themselves or their loved ones through that. So yes, I think that's absolutely the cornerstone, and you can't get to that point unless you've thought about the patient and how they're going to use it, when are they going to use it, is it going to be their children that use it, and what have they got to gain from your therapy. So I think it's absolutely vital, and if that piece is missing, then your whole go-to-market strategy may be flawed.
Maybe just to continue that thread, I think when you look at the cost paradigm, I think we have to factor in the overall kind of health and economic burden of some of the diseases that we're talking about. So if we're talking about the chronic diseases and the shift in demographic that we've been referring to, I think that, the top 5 chronic diseases just by 2030. So if you think, extrapolate that out to 2050, we'll have a global combined kind of health and economic burden of around $47 trillion. And a lot of that's because we're only treating once people are in a hospital situation. So the healthcare paradigm is very much around kind of emergency treatment, reactive treatment. So actually, if we can invest and develop those innovative therapies where we can catch disease earlier, so including some of those combinations that we were talking about, so we can actually prevent people ultimately ending up in hospital, then, obviously there's the aspect of payment for the treatment, but when you look at that overall kind of health economics, hopefully we can keep people out of hospital. If we can also keep people living healthier lives for longer, so not just living longer, but living healthier for longer, then they're hopefully able to stay in work for longer and so on. So I think you very much have to look, when you think about how medicines will be paid for, I think really thinking about that entire kind of health and economic paradigm, not necessarily just looking at the individual medicines.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I was going to say it's about, I think, hopefully by 2050, we'll have figured out a way to actually qualify the actual economic benefits of actually keeping people in work, keeping people with their family, keeping people doing what they actually want to do. I mean, I think that's the other thing about disease. We think about curing the patient, but then we don't think about the wider sort of lives of patients. Like, does it mean that I can, pick up my child or play with my child, or does it mean I can carry on working? So I think I'm hoping by 2050, reimbursement would have figured out how to actually quantify the value of those ordinary day things, and then think about those are worth reimbursing. And I think maybe AI, I know we weren't going to try and talk too much about AI, but we know it's hard to avoid. I'm hoping that AI might be able to provide some sort of solutions around actually quantifying the costs of those social, economic benefits of medicine.
And it's spot on, because I think, so right now, this is already the pressing issue. So we're sort of at kind of like bursting points. If you look at all the Trump tariffs right now, those are based on where he perceives inequity to be for the US, and you look at the $1 trillion kind of healthcare kind of market that's the US. If you go back pre-COVID, already the rise in healthcare costs were outstripping growth in GDP in most countries around the world by 2 times. So that's unsustainable already. And then COVID happens, and then kind of puts a burden on the state. And then exactly as we sort of get talking about, the types of innovative science are high-value medicines. So those are actually putting an increasing burden on. So if you fast forward to 2050, what we've got to look at is sort of the cost of value, but actually, do you pay for value, or do you pay for the diagnostic? So most firms are most sort of pharma companies at the moment are already looking at, actually a diagnostic or a companion related to their innovative science that they're developing at the moment. So do you pay for something that you believe is going to work because you've worked out the cohort of patients, or do you pay for the outcome? So you actually don't pay until the patient is well, or has, the disease has gone away, or has got to a paradigm of quality of life, for example. So those types of principles exist today, but they're not greatly proved out. And I think it's exactly as kind of you were saying. I think the data hasn't been there sufficiently enough to prove the outcome. But then it starts to change the whole model of actually how you pay for medicines.
So working in precision medicine, I would say I agree with what's being said. I mean, one of the things for sure is more value-based outcome. You can see in diagnostics is slowly changing. You can see that the models are evolving. The investors are understanding. It's taking time, right? What's the value of having good diagnostics? But the system is not yet incentivized. So, I would say, show me the incentive, I show you the outcome, as you know. So I think we're slowly getting there. But I can give you very specific examples, like you take fatty liver disease, which is MASH, which is a big problem. You have like 8%, well, 5 to 8% of adults, they have this, which linked to a lot of comorbidities, etc. And you have like 40% responders now, which is relatively low. So if you could do more precision, you could be more precise, you would have much more value for money. And then I want to add, as you know, the aging society is you have more older people, we can't finance our lifestyle. So we're going to have to make decisions. And therefore, the logical things to think about is about prevention. We really hope, because I'm part of this, that I think you incentivize more investors' innovation into prevention as opposed to, sick care versus healthcare. Right? So it doesn't come from me. David Pryor, the ex-NHS, saying, we just do sick management at the moment, right? Which is diagnose and treat versus predict and prevent. So let's really hope, and I think we have no choice. Next to 5 years, we move much more to predict and prevent.
Thank you. And just taking that idea a bit further, any other changes to funding models that you think we're likely to see in the next 25 years, or the way that healthcare providers interact with patients? I mean, we've seen an increase in direct-to-consumer provision of GLP-1 agonists. Is that something that will continue? What are your thoughts?
I think it will continue, but I think it'll only be a certain sort of niche of medicines, and it's also about the pricing points. I mean, GLP-1s are relatively affordable. I think some of the cell therapy is definitely not, but we were seeing also, which is quite interesting, some of the more some consumer based healthcare problems. So I think last month we had 2 companies scored over 250 million in venture capital funding for hair loss. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's something that affects both men and women. It's something that ultimately could be affordable. I mean, it's made people think it's not serious science, but I think the people that are losing their hair are quite concerned about it. And I think with models that are more around perhaps aesthetic side of healthcare, I think they're more amenable to the kind of sort of like, direct consumer models, and maybe potentially some of the chronic issues. But, things like blood pressure, hypertension, I think would still remain prescription, unless, of course, there are some amazing but relatively affordable drugs that aren't available outside of prescription. But I think it's more about the aesthetics, I think, are going to be those sort of things are going to be more sort of direct to consumer. I don't know if anybody disagrees that there might be other direct to consumer products. But
I do wonder, actually, is a more extreme area, because we talked about neurology, immunology, I think we touched on. I think understanding the gut a lot more is also a very interesting area, because actually what we don't, I think, fully understand is, are there neurotransmitters that actually are more gut controllers, which actually means that food and actually our diet becomes part of the actual equation. So we see more around food science as opposed to, as part of the kind of like the well-being side of things.
I'd probably pick up the elephant in the room, which is the NHS, right? because that's what we're trying to deliver the healthcare through, and the prevention and piece is so important, but actually it's doing nothing but firefighting. For context, I'm a surgeon by training. I lead the clinical innovation pathway here at the Royal Society of Medicine as well, so it's very close to my heart. But just some figures, and I'm sure people know that, NHS funding about 7 years ago was just over 100 billion. It is now over 210 billion. That's a huge amount of cash. The recent report that came out from the NHS 10-year plan that looked at the efficiency of extra funding that went towards diagnostic and treatment showed it's been basically failing in all its metrics. 40% of NHS funding is going on staff, and that has expanded by about 30% for an equivalent drop in productivity. So whenever we're talking about how we're going to pay for things and what we're going to do and how we're going to treat and prevent, we have to have an honest conversation about the role of the NHS and how we deliver healthcare. And probably, and this may not be very popular, but just to see how we can perhaps provide the prevention piece, the direct-to-consumer piece, the innovation piece, the funding piece, alongside of that, and not entirely rely on the NHS to deliver it. I don't know how we do that, but actually having that conversation would I think be a worthwhile one.
Well, we're seeing Nigel Farage has, I think, mooted the idea of perhaps sort of like, insurance alongside NHS provision. So we might, and I mean, the predictions are that the Reform government are going to win the next election. So those conversations about how we pay for care in the UK might actually change in the next 5 years, I'd say.
Yeah, well, so if you look at the US model that clearly apply this, and we operate in the US market, so 70% is paid by private insurers, so people below 65, they just pay for their healthcare insurance. And obviously the way they think is different, which is interesting, but it comes with some issues as well. Obviously they look at their P&L, which is very different from NHS, which is a 30-year view. You have to put a health economics plan to show 30 years, you can get money back. The private insurers are very, very simple. They say 5-year P&L, do I save money, yes or no, and let's engage if it's the case. However, if you're above 65, you move to Medicaid and you're out of my P&L. So why should I pay treatment that I get my money back when you are 68, right? And so there are pros and cons. But I believe that there's almost no choice. The citizen, predict and prevent, they have to start taking care more of themselves. The state won't be able, the government won't be, the welfare state that were promised World War II won't be able to do that anymore. So you have to really be much more active. I think the private system will take a much bigger place, and I also see a lot of investment going to, I would say, more individual experience about how you deal with your health. And I think it's one of the questions maybe for later, but I can definitely see that is moving a little bit away, more for just, I would say, certain time of high complexity, high capital intensive intervention that would definitely keep in the kind of centralized system, but all the things will be more done privately, I would imagine.
I think I agree with you, Pierre, because what I'm noticing, because I'm of a certain age, but I know some young people, but they are very much more, I think they're very more proactive about their health and monitoring their health. They are the biggest users of digital apps around, particularly women. They use it to monitor their menstrual cycles, fertility. I keep seeing people with these rings on, and they're the ones that measure your blood pressure, your sleep, and people are using those. And I think people under 35 are definitely more they're basically embracing these technologies, monitoring technologies, are more wedded in terms of prevention and monitoring their health.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that actually, if you bring it back to science, we have a real opportunity. It's a really exciting time. We really are starting to understand the complexity and the drivers of disease far more than we used to with all of the sort of access to genomic data that we have. We understand patient heterogeneity way more than we used to. And I think that then coupled with what you were saying around engagement in kind of active and early monitoring means we really do have that opportunity with, picking up on the sick care to healthcare paradigm. I think we absolutely have the opportunity to intervene earlier, to engage with people in a very different way about managing their own healthcare. And so, I think to be positive at the end, I think that is a real opportunity. The science is there, the technology is there, and the engagement is there, I think.
It's also about data. All of these devices are generating data. And I think that is going to be the biggest revolution of the next 25 years, how we use healthcare data.
and this is always interesting because I've been part of the different discussions. So of course there's some hype. I mean, you know, when I talk with big pharma companies, I think they get very excited about this. Which I'm like, really? Are you really excited about this? Because there's so much. 3 types of variations: biological variations, identical variations, side variations. Big variation among all the data. So the big challenge would be to put this together, and it makes even sense because we're still very far away, right? But I think we can start with the Pareto rule, right? Let's start with the kind of low complexity, high impact stuff and go down, but I think it will still take a while. And then in terms of computing powers and AI, which we shouldn't talk much about, but there are some limitation about irreducibility, things you cannot compress in terms of calculations. There are still a lot of things that going to take a lot of time to get there. But I think I'm certainly excited, being precision medicine, to at least being able to try to offer higher quality data, but it will take some time.
I'll probably just pick up that one last point on the data piece, which I think is really, really difficult because everyone touts, the NHS has got the richest data set with all the patients in it, and it does, except it's impenetrable because it is on completely different systems wherever you go. There's no 2 systems that are the same. How people code and capture that data, if anyone can do it, Palantir can, obviously, but it is really, really difficult. So there's a huge data source out there. But if you've ever been in an NHS waiting room and or ever run an NHS clinic, you know that if your computer boots up after you've kicked it 3 times and etc., then you're doing really well. So to go from that and jump into a data set that we can interpret and use is going to take some time.
And so just taking that a step forward, looking at the interaction between tech and bio, I mean, what are the implications, do you think, for smaller companies? Perhaps in the past, their IP assets would have been primarily or principally in their patent portfolio. How do you see that changing? What can they do to sort of defend themselves against that? Is it the protection of data? How do you see it?
I think I agree with you, Will. I think the paradigm changed a little bit. I mean, it's great to file IP, it's great to tick the box for investors, etc. But the pace at which you can become obsolete is real. I think the real moat, I think, is underappreciated at the moment and looking at data, is high quality data, right? So the analogy is like crude oil versus refined oil, right? So if you look at the data, I think there are a lot of crude oil out there, but not very well refined. So you can't really use it very well. But I think the moat would be private data. I think public data is available to everyone, but having high quality private data is real moat on top of the IP, of course, because to protect this, you are the expert, but how you protect your data sets, right? So I think this is definitely going to be more important in the future than just the IP and the method itself. And also, of course, the team, right? The high-quality team that can execute. I look at the ecosystem. I think in Europe and the UK is still there, but I think like high-quality teams that can really deliver, and you start this kind of virtuous cycle of people who exited late, understand about commercial stage, can connect, etc. I think this is also going to improve in the UK and Europe. I really hope so. And if you combine, this is one of the biggest moat I can see. If you look at other industry, which I used to be part of, that the biggest franchise is really the team, the culture, the quality of what they do, on top, of course, of IP. And the infrastructure that goes with it.
I was just going to add in, I think that one of the very interesting facts you look at is the rise of technology companies, and particularly these hyperscalers, and the volume of data they have, and the depth of data they have about all of us. So if you engage with a Meta platform, if you're on any sort of social media sites, the data that's being collected is incredible. And then you've kind of look at the sort of algorithms they put on top of them and the type of research and data mining they can do, and that's very kind of data-centric for those. Then you sort of dial it a bit back, like Nara was saying, you look at the NHS, or you look at kind of regions and how segmented things are. And actually, it's not entirely dissimilar in larger, more traditional companies that have scale, or some of our scientific and manufacturing companies. So actually, then when you look at the sort of the startup side of things, actually look at where investment's going. And actually, what's really interesting is actually in alliances last year, the biggest percentage of real investment was in China. So 35% of overall life sciences type environment was in China. Those that are data related were actually also a high proportion of that investment. And the overall investment pool is around about 160 billion last year. And that's probably been flat for about the last 3-4 years. So the overall pool of those that are dealing with alliances. So actually, if you look at kind of where things are already starting to go, partly it's a follow the investment, follow the money, look at the types of either startups or bets that people are placing, and you get an idea. On the IP topic, it's really interesting because actually I saw some of the those sort of stands outside in IP. So even today, actually, because of the pace of change with some of the science that's coming through, and then even if you look at editing now and sort of gene editing, CRISPR techniques like that, and how they will change. Actually, look at where's the IP. So is the IP in the technology, or is the IP in the outcome of what you're doing, or what you own, or actually then the what it is that's the therapy. So already it's actually a quite difficult challenge. And you fast forward that, I think the IP space becomes very interesting. But I think the real richness is in the data and these algorithms without kind of getting into AI.
Thank you. Sorry, Nara, did you have a comment?
No, I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think the one last bit I would say is I think that the data piece is a really tricky one, because particularly when you're quite small, I think you don't have a lot of data. That's the end. That's the truth of it. So you have to be really, really clear of what data you are trying to get, and what is the data that's going to give you that next step. That inflection that's going to take you to either the next level of funding or the next clinical trial, or will unlock the next step you're trying to do. So I think it's probably the most crucial thing that you have to ask yourself on a day-to-day is what is that crucial piece of data that you're looking for.
Yeah, I just want to add, it's a very good point, and sometimes it's not intuitive actually to understand, because you have all this public knowledge, but then, I mean, the kind of analogy I have is like, do you imagine you sort of have you digitalize in 3D a complete city, right? So it's a huge amount of data, this public knowledge, and then you're gonna come up with extremely very specified type of data that actually really gotta start connecting some dots no one can connect. So for instance, right? Oh, I just find out that there is a map of the tube, right? So just these 2 lines, I just connected this, which is nothing compared to the other public knowledge. But all of a sudden, you start being able to extract a lot of value from it, right? So I think certainly this is some of the things we do, because when we start small, you have no choice, right? So exactly what you said, really trying to connect so that no one can connect using this huge level of data sets available, I think is achievable.
For me, I think around IP is going to be quite interesting around AI-developed drugs. Where is the IP? Is it in the actual kind of product, or is it in actually the large language model? And are they patentable? I'm not entirely sure, and maybe you're better person to ask this, Will, whether or not we've actually got to the bottom of the IP around AI-developed drugs.
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe one for the panel next year or something. Very good. Now, I think time is slightly against us, but were there any other last of extremely brief thoughts on this panel? I appreciate we just skipped over things, but by necessity.
I think I'd like to go back to a point that Pervaise made, and I loved his utopian vision of the a global healthy world, but I'm slightly a lot more cynical, maybe it's because I'm a journalist, but I worry about the kind of sort of the Western haves and Western and maybe Asian haves, and then the rest of the world's have-nots. And what does that mean when we have, these so-called developed societies that have these amazing healthcare, and then we have other parts of the world that have pretty much nothing?
I think that's an incredibly important point. I think we have to think about that right from the very beginning of the drug discovery paradigm in terms of the diversity of genomic data that we're using to even select drug targets in the first place, and making sure that's representative. I think some of the areas with the biggest burden of disease, some of those populations are the least represented currently in some of the genomic data sets. So we're working, certainly AstraZeneca, working really hard to increase the diversity of those data sets, and then all the way through to clinical trial diversity, and making sure that the medicines that we're developing add value for people all around the world. And that will look different in different parts of the world as well. And I think that's also where some of the innovative modalities come in, because, again, access to different types of modality in medicine will be different in different parts of the world with different supply chains. So I think, really important point.
So, for me, maybe just 2 thoughts. One is something I'm more exposed to, so easier to comment, so precision medicine. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the next 25 years to be able to design something that is more specific to you. And I don't think I mean, 20 years ago, we used to call it personalized medicine. Now it's called precision medicine because actually there was an Obama thing, 2016, so we say precision medicine now. And we say, oh, you know, we'll design a drug specific to you, right? Literally, we're gonna, you know, do genomics, and this is so where this was a bit fantasy, I would say. But I think what is achievable is to do something like depending on your shoe size, if you will, right? So you would have a selection maybe of 5, 6 drugs, right, specific to you, depending on your shoe size. So it'd be not tailor-made, but ready, you know, ready-made, I would say. So I think this is achievable, and we already see some indication here and there. I mean, lung cancer, breast cancer is just the beginning, but there will be much more that will be coming. The second, which is also of interest, is when you look into what could have the biggest impact for the developing world, actually, it's not really the 4 horsemen, it's more about infectious disease, how you deal with infectious disease. And this can have a huge impact on the developing world the next 25 years. So just wanted to bring that up because they obviously the priorities are different. You know, they care less about longevity, but more about infectious disease and other type of topics. So I think there is also a lot of work being done, and I think there are a lot of opportunities as well there.
I suppose my take home would be to really push on that innovation mindset. And to be truly innovative, we need to take risks, and I think we should do that at all level. I think that's one of the things that differentiates high output organizations from those that take the slightly sort of safer route. So I think it's incumbent on us as the haves, because the more shots on goal we take, the more medicines we develop, and you just have to look at the GLP-1 story as to how that went from something that was very expensive to actually being relatively affordable. And the more we do that with all different types of drug, whether it's infectious diseases, you know, fatty liver, you know, autoimmune disease, etc., the better we are at coming up with therapies that have the supply chain and the cost price point to make it transferable worldwide.
So in my utopian world of democratized healthcare, I had 2 angles I could go, which was for what we are developing and the more knowledge we gain around the body and around actually how to keep us well, and the great potential of these techniques is incredible. My headwinds approach was also, if you put that in the hands of bad actors, the converse is possible. So for the next hour, I'm going to talk about all the headwinds. No, so I think for us, it's...
I'll join you.
It's sort of upbeat, we have the potential. And I think if you look at the future, and actually what used to hold us back was actually, frankly, the technology and the pace we could do things. When you go back to old school research I used to do, I mean, it would take hours to do one technique, and now it's done. So, I mean, my message would be, we have the potential. It's up to us how we use it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That seems a good moment to conclude things. It's been really thought-provoking discussion. We've obviously only had time to scratch the surface, really, so maybe we can have a conversation over lunch or whatever to take it further. But for now, thank you very much to the panel members.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Will, for your expert moderation and for the panelists' insights. It's such a privilege to be part and witness discussions where in the future we can say that we were here when it was discussed first. And hopefully the queue for the Santa box will be overflowing during lunch, so hope to see all of your wishes come through. Our next session is actually a really nice segue, because a really key part of developing medicines is patient centricity and patient empowerment. And actually, in the previous session, there were some nods to patient empowerment. So it's a really key theme. So our next session is going to discuss being patient-centric and the unique lessons that we can leverage from rare disease R&D. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Phil Elstob from Cambridge Enterprise, and if Phil's panel would join him as well. So thank you very much, and please welcome them up.
Great, thank you very much. So in the first session today, we heard from Mike that rare disease is the new growth engine. And then in the last session, we heard from Nara that keeping patients at the forefront of the mind. So this session brings those two together, and we're going to take a very patient-centric look and ask the question around lessons from rare diseases. My name's Phil Elstob. I'm Commercialization Director with Cambridge Enterprise, which is the innovation arm of the University of Cambridge. Now, we very infrequently see rare disease type technologies come out of academic labs, so I'm not the expert here at all. But what we have is a panel of experts around rare diseases and around clinical trials to help us discuss this topic today. So what I thought I'd do, we've got all of your biographies in the app, but if you could maybe just give us a brief introduction to yourselves, and if we start at the left-hand side with Famida, please.
Great, thank you. So, hi everybody. My name is Famida Gwadry-Sridhar. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Pulse InfoFrame, and we have built an evidence generation platform for real-world data, getting data both from hospitals as well as from patients directly, and then harmonizing it and using it for everything from natural history to external control arms, patient registries, and supporting market access and safety. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Victoria English. I'm a journalist and currently a publisher. I began my career as a financial journalist and was sent abroad by Dow Jones to set up a new bureau in Amsterdam. And I've stayed. And I've spent most of my life in Europe. I went from Dow Jones to McGraw-Hill and then Reuters. And so it was at Reuters that I started my healthcare business, or my healthcare. I helped Reuters set up a news service for the National Health Service, but we had to shut it down after a year and a half. Then I went to a small British publisher, which published the magazine Scrip. So I worked for Scrip for a while, and then I edited the Regulatory Affairs Journal, and that's when I really started to take off in terms of my understanding and appreciation of regulation and the legal aspects. And so my late husband and I then set up our own company. And we're looking at innovation in healthcare and particularly the financial aspect and how to get funded and how to get to the market.
Thank you. Lars.
Shall I go next? Yes. Good afternoon or good morning. I think I'm in the way of your lunch, right? Anyway, my brief history is I'm a clinical academic. I was a VP at 2 large pharma companies, and now I'm an advisor, company founder, advisor to biotech companies and venture capital firms. But the reason why I'm here, I suppose, is because I run drug development at Cancer Research UK, specifically the Center for Drug Development there, where we run about 15 or 20 early stage clinical studies in cancer.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ron Jortner. I'm the founder of Aspire Biosciences. I'm a neuroscientist by my background. I spent a long time in academia, but later I started a consulting firm in neuroscience, and my career path changed when one of my clients actually came with their 8-year-old daughter and asked me to find some information about a disease that the GP had never heard about. So I started digging in and got very, very interested in these diseases and ended up moving into the rare disease field. And I now am CEO of a company called Aspire Biosciences. And we work with patient associations to actually find and develop treatments for rare disorders in the CNS, the metabolic, and the hematology spaces. So that's my background.
Good morning. I'm Victor Lops. I am the person here who is not an expert in rare diseases, actually. So put my cards on the table right now. I am, however, the Chief Medical Officer for TrialMed, which is a global site management organization of 250 plus dedicated clinical research sites around the world. Owned by one of the meeting sponsors, by Thermo Fisher. And so I have a very broad experience in the conduct of clinical trials across phases 1 to 4. and certainly have a sort of fairly patient-centric view of the world from my former life as a dyed-in-the-wool NHS doctor and former professor of oncology at the University of Edinburgh. And so I have a couple of views on life, if you get my point. But I've also been in the sort of commercial world, CEO of some one or two very small companies around AI in healthcare and imaging and so on. So nice to meet everybody.
Great, thank you very much. And what we have with this panel is we've got people who are drug hunters, got people who are collecting data and manipulating data, we've got clinical trialists, and then we've got the regulatory view as well. So we're going to go through the whole area here. But before we do that, I thought I'd just give a few sound bites around rare diseases, just to position this for the audience. These are chronic, debilitating, sometimes life-threatening. Quite often they are complex multi-system disorders, and there are less than 5% of registered drugs for rare diseases. Now, they are rare on an individual basis, but if you look, there are 500 million people around the world with a rare disease. 3.5 million of those are in the UK, and over half tend to be children. So that there's a real need here. If you look at how many rare diseases, we've registered about 7,000, maybe a little bit over that so far, but it's quite difficult to count them because what's a rare disease in one territory may not be rare in another. And a really great example of that is sickle cell disease. So sickle cell is rare in Europe, but is quite common in certain African countries. And then if you look at the FDA definition, pancreatic cancer is rare in the US. It's not rare under the definition in Europe. There was some really nice data released by Chiesi on 24 rare diseases, where the total cost to society was $125 billion. And when you break that down on average, it's $266,000 per patient per year, compared to $26,000 per patient per year for the more prevalent diseases. So a tenfold increase in economic burden when we're looking at the rare disease setting. And of course, we have patient advocates who have a strong voice in the area. A lot of these people, they're family members of people who have rare diseases, so they're really driven to make a difference. And we tend to find they're really up to speed on the research. They know the area extremely well. So that's the background I was going to give here. And what we're going to do is touch on each of those areas. And I'm going to go to Ronnie first, because Ronnie, you work closely with biotech and pharma companies, and also with those patient groups in terms of looking to identify new medicines for rare diseases. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on those partnerships that you're working with, but also why is the patient so important here? Why is that interaction so important to you?
Thank you for the question. So if you want to develop a treatment for something like type 2 diabetes, which is a common disease, your point of contact, if you're a company, would be to find a key opinion leader clinician who is an expert on type 2 diabetes, and they are sort of the hub of knowledge. So obviously you need knowledge of different types. You need academic knowledge about the pathways and the targets. You need clinical knowledge about the clinical picture of this disease and biomarkers. You need, of course, the patient perspective, but the person who is your hub of knowledge would be that hotshot clinician who knows everything about diabetes and maybe has, is head of a hospital. Or if you go to rare diseases, and I'll give an example, I don't know, something like ring chromosome 20 syndrome, which I guess a lot of people in this room have never even heard about. You go to the world expert on this disease or a similar disease, and you realize their expertise comes from seeing 10, 15 patients over their entire career. And actually, they can't make a living off that. They see many other conditions which, have something common, something similar, are either chromosomal or have to do with epilepsy. But that's actually not your expert. The mom who started the foundation, who has a child with this disease, She knows every cluster of patients around the world. She knows every clinician who ever had a patient with this disease. She knows every paper that's ever been published and every author who wrote it. So that's your hub of knowledge. It doesn't replace the clinicians and the scientists, but that is where the dots connect. And this is what I do in my role. I have a company, a commercial company that develops treatments, but we use these hubs, these patient groups, to find all the information and then to find the technology that fits to it. So if you will, we go the opposite way by opening a call to patient groups and saying, hey, we're going to do a cohort in rare neurodegenerative diseases. Would you like to apply? And then they come to us and we guide them through a process of populating as close as you will to a pre-IND submission without the technology, if you will. So we build things such as registry and natural history, lists of biomarkers, suggested targets that Pharma never heard about from their academics. And then we go and hunt for the technology, completely open to any modality and anything. So it's just an opposite way of doing things, but in the rare disease, a lot of things are opposite and make sense.
And where do you hunt for those technologies? How do you bring those technologies in once you have all of that knowledge and information?
We come to conferences such as this and look for companies who are doing interesting things and who are interested in the therapeutic areas. And then we bring them on board and we speed date them with the scientists that are representing the patient groups and with the patient advocates and find the matches there. And the benefit for the patients is very clear because it's a disease that otherwise wouldn't be looked at. But the benefit for the company is huge because if it's an early stage startup, for example, and they have a platform and they want to go and cure Alzheimer's because their investors are pushing them to do it and because that's what they heard about in medical school or in university, but we discover for them a disease that is a good match for the technology, but where you can get away with one clinical center with 24 patients for a phase 2-3, that is a huge benefit for a company. And that's a way to get in. And later you can still go for the bigger indications, doesn't stop you. So that's the synergy we are looking for. And that's why we put the patients, the patient advocacies first in the chain we work, rather than going to them last when we have a clinical trial, as used to be the traditional way of going to rare disease patient groups. We start with them and use them to actually build the basics.
Great, thank you. And do you have an example that you could share of one of these that has gone through that process?
Yeah, I have several examples. One that I'm happy to share is we had a small company come to us with a technology, it's spin out of university, with a technology that can flip oxidation state of iron ions. And essentially the idea was to go for Alzheimer's disease, because this is the founder who was a biophysicist. This is what they wanted to do. And we actually, a company like that spins out and then realizes you don't go and do a phase 2-3 in Alzheimer's with a company of 3 people. This is a big ask, and you need 10 years, and you need thousands of patients, and you need 40 plus clinical centers, and you need, what, $300 million? Is that a fair number? Yeah. We actually found a fantastic match for this technology in Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is a devastating disease and has absolutely nothing. And it affects 2 per million per year, so that's still 20,000 people per year, and all of them die. And there's nothing for this condition. It's one of the worst neurodegenerative conditions there are, and one of the fastest. And we found a really good match between this technology and the mechanism of prion propagation. So we connected them, and essentially, we are the ones project managing and coordinating this. So this is a program that we are partnered on. The other programs we have usually go to the company that owns the technology, so they're usually very happy to do it. So we have about 14 of the programs that are given to clients and to the companies, and we have 2 programs that we're doing partnered. One is the Creutzfeldt-Jakob one, and the other one we're not disclosing yet.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank
Nice
you.
example. I'm going to move this on to Famida next, because you also work with patient groups as well in terms of collecting and storing real-world data. Maybe I could ask you to give us a definition of real-world data, just for people in the audience who've maybe not come across it before, and maybe from the perspective also of natural history data as well, and then go on to say how this is being used from a rare diseases setting, yes?
Sure, thank you. So I think just to start, if you kind of think about how trials are normally done or have been done in the past, especially in large diseases, it's always a randomized controlled trial. I didn't say in my introduction that I am a trialist and a methodologist, and was formerly a professor of medicine and computer science, and saw that you needed the intersection of both technology and science to come together. So having said that, traditionally in evidence-based medicine, it's a trial. In rare diseases, how do you do a randomized controlled trial? As Ronnie said, sometimes your N is actually quite small, so you have to be smart about what you do. So think about real-world data as a mechanism for us to think about observational studies and how we actually use data outside of a randomized controlled trial to utilize the data. So both the FDA and EMA have definitions for real-world data, and they include large data. You hear this a lot, particularly in the US, where you're working with claims data, but that's very broad data. And in the rare disease space, sometimes patients don't even have an ICD code, and you have to try to figure out what the depth of data is and how to find those patients. So real-world data can extend from large data sets that exist. Wearables are real-world data. Data comes in from multiple sources. You have secondary source data, so these are the aggregate data, such as claims data, that have come together and been put together for the purpose of using for whatever mechanism, and it could be for payment, not necessarily for developing treatments. Then we start to go a bit deeper with real-world data, and what we look at is really fit-for-purpose data. This is primary source data that actually comes from the source. It comes from the patient, it comes from the hospital, it comes not just from the structured data in the electronic health records, which are there, and remember that EHRs were initially built really for administration and billing. It's really the data that are in the clinical notes that are often scribbled and not always consistent. So it's a big definition, but real-world data that's fit for purpose is really what the regulators are looking for, and maybe we can talk about that next. I think that was the next part of your question.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
continue.
When you look at data and how we approach data is we do work with patient advocacy groups, and we also talk to the key opinion leaders, and then we talk to the pharma companies where they have subject matter expertise. What we want is really a convergence of what each of those believe is important. So from a patient's perspective, as Ronnie mentioned, patients have the lived experience, them and their caregivers. They understand the impact. A lot of that information is qualitative, but you have to embed that in the calculus of how you're considering real-world data and curating it. And then the key opinion leaders really understand the type of patient they see and the tremendous variability in patients, because they don't see thousands of patients. They may see 5, they may see 10. And the companies have a perspective about their product and how their product either is in development or needs to be approved, or it has been approved and people are not utilizing it in a rare disease. And again, you're trying to figure out exactly, what the reason is and how you actually develop a story around real-world data. So I'll go to the last part of this, which is natural history studies. There is such a big push to go into first-in-human that many companies skip the part of understanding the human. And I know that sounds a bit crass, but there's investor pressure to say, look, you have to get your molecule into first-in-human. There are a dearth of failures in 2024 and 2025 where molecules have failed. And if you look at why, and I won't name the companies, but we understand that sometimes the natural history in that population was not well understood. And some of these companies have taken existing data and tried to mesh it together. And in the meshing, you're not necessarily getting, an appropriate framework to understand the natural history of the patient. In doing that, and you rush into human, There have been clinical holds on gene therapy. There has been mortality in patients, etc. So the beginning part is really how do we understand the patient journey? And if you don't understand that, and it may seem intuitive, because just because you understand the disease, it doesn't mean you understand the treatment that the patient got, the failures that they had, and how you're going to actually treat that patient and the appropriate endpoints, which is what you get from natural history. And then you need to target exactly where to treat them. And in a gene therapy, you have a narrow window. And if you make a mistake, it's a catastrophic mistake. So understanding that trajectory, and then prospectively collecting the endpoints, which will help you do one of two things. It will help you with the study design. Can I understand the data to help me design a better phase 2? And ultimately, can I utilize some of those data to build an external control arm, which is a mechanism not to do a randomized control trial, but in a rare disease to see if we can get an accelerated path with the regulators instead of having a randomization arm.
That's great, thank you.
you.
So that really demonstrates the value of that data set and how it can be used for actually controlling when you've got such a small set of patients, getting that control in there into your clinical trial. We're going to move on into the more clinical side of things now. If you look at the rare diseases pipeline, actually the large proportion of drugs in that pipeline are against cancer. And also, there have been a lot of orphan drug approvals for cancer. So we're already in a good place, but I suspect there's a lot more that could be done here. And Lars, you're looking from a Cancer Research UK perspective. Be interested to hear what approaches and what partnerships are evolving within your ecosystem around ensuring that those patients with rare cancers are better served.
Yeah, thank you. I may disagree. I think we're not doing enough in cancer for rare cancers.
Mm-hmm.
And I maybe get to that in more detail. But if you think about that, half of you will develop cancer in your lifetime. That's a fact, that's reality. And that 25% of all cancers are rare cancer. So you've got roughly a 1 in 8 chance of having a rare cancer in your lifetime. And this includes, of course, pediatric cancers, which you all have gone past, I would say. But all the pediatric cancers are rare cancers. And pediatric cancer has been neglected by the pharmaceutical industry and by venture capital. And one goes with the other, right? If the pharmaceutical industry is not interested because the commercial value is small, then venture capital will not invest money because it's harder to, pass it on to pharma. So we are actually in a complicated space. When you look at this a little bit further and look at the rare cancer in children, there isn't actually enough research there to put us in a position to start developing clinical studies in these patient groups because it has to come from a basis of knowledge. And again, that is driven by downstream investment, but it's also by not having necessarily the research base. We've got a large research base now in cancer, let's say in lung cancer and breast cancer, and made enormous progress in those indications where survival rates are, much longer than they used to be. And that is good. The problem, though, is for the rare cancers, if CA UK now puts out a grant call, we get a lot of applications in those areas where we already are strong, because that's where people have been working for years and they want to develop further. We see a lot less for those cancers that actually have the unmet need, the poor survival rates, and that's a real concern. So at CA UK, there's a few initiatives to try to address this. One is we've got a big initiative in children and young adults and doing a big fundraising activity in this space, which in true CA UK style, if you go by the name Cancer Research UK, will fund a lot of research in that space. And that is sort of what CA UK has done for decades and has done quite well. The problem that we have to acknowledge, and not just in children's cancer, is that often this research does not get translated into benefit for patients, does not lead to a trial in that indication, but rather some very good researcher produces very good research, identifies a potential path or target, and then they don't have any experience to develop that onwards. And there's no money available if you're in a rare disease. And so we need to find ways as an organization to to build the infrastructure, to build an end-to-end platform to develop drugs in those rare indications. And so in the CYP space of cancer in young adults and pediatric patients, we are trying to do that. And there's a lot of holes to fill. I run the Center for Drug Development at CIA UK, which is very good at running clinical trials in cancer, early stage trial from candidate selection to the end of phase 2. And we are modality agnostic. We run all types of studies. But one thing we had to sort of adapt to and realize is if we really want to run these trials in rare cancers and pediatric cancers, we need a whole new model for doing this. Because it's CIA UK, the other thing in the name is UK. We've been running trials in the UK for the last 30 years or so, and just in the UK. No patient was ever recruited in a center outside of Britain. And that's a problem if you're running a rare cancer trial because you need to access the necessary patients. And that is much easier if you have got patients in the UK and other European countries. And we have made this transition and actually actively now running in trials, which will always be run in the UK because we are CIA UK. But these trials will actually also have centers in Norway, Germany, and Spain across Europe. So these are pan-European trials. And then you learn something else that's important that's come up in some discussions we've had here today, and that's the NHS. When I run a trial in the UK, I often run into problems because in a center somewhere in the UK, I can't get a PK sample at midnight because there are no nurses available on the NHS to do so. And in our first trial that we ran outside of the UK, we went to Oslo, and I went to see the center there in Norway, and it was fantastic. They had everything. They had staffing. They have the resources. And lo and behold, when they entered the clinical trial, they were recruiting faster than any of the UK sites. So that is one of the things that need to be addressed for us to be better at this. But the European partnership per se has worked really, really well for us because it allows us to run these more complex trials where you can only recruit a limited number of patients per site. It gives us access to healthcare structures that actually are functioning and are able to transfer patients. For example, in Norway, they transport patients to Oslo from 1,500 miles away, somewhere in North Norway. You try to transfer a patient in the UK from Aberdeen to Birmingham. It's nigh impossible, right? So these kind of things are all issues for rare cancers.
And just out of interest, do you see a future, because some of these diseases are very rare, where we were talking about 10 to 15 patients, do you see a future where we might be able to expand that even further beyond Europe and bring the US into some of these studies, where you've got such small patient numbers?
So we've been successful in doing this across Europe because we've done partnerships with like-minded charitable organizations, for example, the Norwegian Cancer Society, the Dutch Cancer Society. And when you talk to them and you think about can we do a global trial, the problem you run into with the US is liability. Mm-hmm. And that is what these societies are deeply concerned about, because you don't get sued for having done something wrong for a few 100,000, you get sued for a few billion. And so for us to expand in the US will be difficult, but we do have partnerships and we've got American experts on our panels. It is, in my view, the next step of this iteration is to run a global trial where we would run a European component of it, but the MD Anderson Cancer Center or Dana-Farber runs the US component of it, and you pool and pair the data. I think that's feasible.
Great. Thank you very much, Lars. So again, really putting the patients at the center of what Cancer Research UK are looking to do there in the early adult and children setting. So moving on to Victor, who you up front said you're not the rare disease expert, but we had a really interesting discussion when we were talking about this panel, and I think, Victor, you said that you no longer say that you recruit patients anymore, and you refer to recruitment almost as a dirty word. So I'd love to hear more about this, and particularly about your patient-centric approach as well in your organisation.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that quote. But it is it's more about, I guess, the mindset than everyday actuality just now. but it is one that we drive very, very firmly in the business. And I talk about, recruitment is a dirty word, almost as if by that point, if I'm having to recruit, there's an implication there of something quite active. I'm almost, introducing the bias that that my business is seeking to remove, because, we're the experts in the randomized control trial, which we now recognize is not necessarily going to work in this rare disease setting. I talk about empowering patients to be wanting to take part, or potentially to take part in clinical trials, empowering them to have the knowledge and understanding of what a clinical trial can bring to their healthcare journey. That's a euphemism, I think, but bring to their life in terms of improving health and improving outcomes. So empowering them to understand that they have a rich history in their medical background, in their medical history, even though it may be largely unstructured. And of course, we all know that there are then ways of structuring that so that it becomes useful to a trialist like myself. But empowering them to have confidence as well in our trade, in our business, in everything that I guess everybody in this room does, whether it's on the provider side like myself in sites, or whether you're in the pharma side. You could forgive a patient for having less than 100% confidence in the drug development industry through various things that have happened over recent years. And huge, pointed out, I think somebody pointed out, Lars pointed out, huge settlements in the US, and I think you've probably all watched Dopesick on BBC, and so we haven't covered ourselves in glory, but we are wanting and absolutely require patients to be part of studies. It takes two people to run a clinical trial, a patient and a PI. From the regulatory perspective. And so, we have to have that patient partnership, and we have to empower them such that taking part in a clinical trial becomes, I talk about clinical research as a care option, CRACO, and I think there's even a US conference with just that title, so that it becomes something additional or supplemental to the healthcare journey. And it becomes very meaningful. It's not an add-on. It's a genuine part of somebody's healthcare. In order to do that, we have to have integrity. We have to look like the healthcare in the country that we operate in, and operate in many countries across the globe. And it's certainly different in the US than it is in the UK than it is in Poland, for example. So we have to have that integrity piece. And then finally, we have to make sure that the burden is lightened. And I think this is the one area where I think we have something to add, where people like myself have something to add for rare disease, which is that over the past, I would say, even 18 months to 2 years, the pharma world has been spending in a very, very different way than it was in the sort of COVID and immediate post-COVID era. Part of that is something to do, I think there was a change of administration in the US earlier this year, and that certainly had a big impact on spending and the confidence. For example, there are an alarmingly small number. In fact, I think it might be virtually zero. Phase 2, 3 upper respiratory tract vaccine studies taking place in the Northern Hemisphere this year. So, how on earth we're going to work out which strains of flu we need to be immunized against, that hasn't been, anyway, we're not here to debate that, but I'm saying there has been a change in the way pharma is spending. And the pivot that businesses like mine have had to make is, what are those pharma folks looking for? And we have pivoted to a much more just-in-time model, one where pharma can plug and play a lot more, and also where we can deliver trials in a different way. So we can deliver trials in people's homes, we can deliver trials virtually, we can deliver trials at their place of work. And if you just want that one little visit, I can give you that one little visit. If you want beginning to end, we can do that as well, and everything in between. I think the point here is about partnering at a really early phase, in that pathway, and partnering with a patient perspective. And that's really my, I guess, my mandate as a CMO in a very large trial network, is to try and make sure that we always maintain that. And I think, there's a lot of learning that comes across both early and late, classical frequentist trialists like myself, and probably the more Bayesian folks that I think sitting over on my right-hand side. So that's how I see it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Empowering patients and starting that partnership early. We're going to finish on the regulatory framework, which is perhaps one of the most important areas, and looking to bring Victoria in on this, because there are small patient numbers here, so we can't rely on the normal gradual approach to regulatory frameworks. So what patient-centric regulatory approaches are you seeing, Victoria, that help maybe accelerate, maybe bring flexibility into this whole process?
Right. Well, I was going to respond first to Famida's comments, which is that the regulatory, excuse me, I have a cold, the regulatory participation in the details of these diseases has accelerated enormously. When I worked, excuse me, when I was editor of the Regulatory Affairs Journal, I covered the introduction of the orphan regulation in Europe. And at that time, the regulatory role was primarily ensuring regulatory exclusivity for these drugs. But now, so okay, I was sorry. I'm terribly sorry. I was speaking on the wrong end, and my cold. I have to apologize for that. So now we have quite an integrated structure within the European Union regarding rare disease drugs. The European Commission has spent, I'll give you the figures, 3.2 billion euros between 2007 and 2020 just on research into rare diseases, giving the regulatory authorities information about some of the diseases that are likely to be presented to them in the form of drug applications. So this is a fairly, and so I can give you an example of how this works. 2 weeks ago, a drug for a disease that I know nothing about, Urquhart-Aldrich syndromes, okay? 10 people in a trial, but the trial itself was backed up by research that had been conducted in coordination with charitable organizations. Primarily, it's an Italian charitable organization that funded it and provided a lot of the information. Mm-hmm. So by the time it reached the regulatory authority, there was a very comprehensive understanding of the disease and how many people were likely to be affected, which is not very many. The actual trial, and this is to Famida's point, the actual trial was 10 people. But in order to get the regulatory approval, it was a positive opinion 2 weeks ago, in order to get the regulatory approval, they got data from other countries on the same disease and integrated it into the regulatory decision making. So one of the points I think should be made about these rare diseases is because the incidence is so low, it's a global effort. This is a global effort in finding medicines for the people that are affected. And I think the regulatory authorities are very well prepared or are working in this way. The other thing that I wanted to say, which is really a linguistic point, is that the word orphan was brought into the language because at the time when these regulatory incentives were first introduced, the big pharma companies didn't care a whit about these drugs and about these patients. So they were brought in as the poor orphans. But actually, the statistics show that there's a bigger increase in applications from drugs for rare diseases than there is for larger indications. Mm-hmm. And so they are rare, but they're not necessarily orphans. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which is really important for me, is that there was another regulatory approval, and this was only on the 24th of November, of a neurological drug for spinal muscular atrophy called, its new name is F.E.C, okay? But it's not F.E.C. F.E.C is just the new name. It was Zolgensma. It was Zolgensma 10 years ago, and I wrote about this and interviewed the people who researched and discovered Zolgensma. And it was very much a collaboration with the patients who were affected. And what happened is Novartis got interested, bought the project, and Novartis, and so the original Zolgensma indication was for pediatrics, okay? And then, interestingly enough, they ran out of patients to sell the drug to because it has a very small incidence. But they've now got an indication for adults, and they now think, at least their key opinion leaders think, that what they know now about this disease already will help them discover more about neurological disease. And this gets me back to what Lisa was saying on the previous panel, that looking ahead, neurology may be one of the big areas of drug discovery, and it could well be the rare diseases, and the research that we've already done could be a key pivotal element in this. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Victoria. I can see that we're reaching the end here, so I will wrap this up. I mean, it's really great to be reminded why many of us in this room do what we do. It's because we're thinking about that patient benefit ultimately. And you know, whether we're working on rare diseases or more common diseases, ultimately we should keep the patient central to what it is we're doing. So please join me in thanking the panel, and thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Phil for your expert moderation, and to the panelists for all of your valuable insights. It's such a shame we can't keep going. There's just so much to talk about. We now break for lunch, so it's your opportunity to visit the exhibitors, enhanced profile takers, keep the conversations going, and then we resume at 1:30, either here for the main program, or we've got the company showcase, whichever you opt for. So please go and enjoy your lunch, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.